Good morning.
Good morning.
It is good to be here. I was deciding whether I was going to tell you guys this lame joke or not, and then I was inspired by Leonard's sweater, so I'm going to tell you this joke. Okay, so what do you call a broke Santa? Saint Nicholas. All right, and then here, this one's even lamer, but here we go. Okay, so what did Adam say to Eve on December 24th?
Where's my rib?
It's Christmas, Eve. So you gotta do the pause, okay? All right, don't worry, if you don't get it, talk to me after service. If you do, good for you. This morning I chose a kind of a slightly different passage. I think when we approach Christmas, especially as we go into the four themes of Advent, we have hope, we have joy, we have peace, and we have love. And, I'm grateful to Byron for switching with me. Usually the order it goes is actually hope, peace, joy, love. But because when we were in our James series, I had spoken on the topic of consider it all joy. I asked, and I was supposed to speak on joy. I asked Byron, hey, can we switch? So, we can have a different, be able to hear about joy from two different passages and also sometimes just hearing a different perspective. So I am covering this topic of peace. And while honestly for Christmas, you always end up kind of in Luke 2, Matthew 2, and of course the Christmas narrative, I actually wanted to take you back from an Old Testament perspective. And so that's why we're in this passage in Isaiah, where Isaiah and his people are looking forward to the coming of Messiah. And in much the same way for us, Christmas ushers in a lot of fulfilled prophecy that ultimately finds its ultimate fulfillment in the second coming of Messiah. Okay, and so it's a slightly different thought in terms of Christmas-wise, but I think hopefully you will see where I am going with this as soon as my computer decides to cooperate. Okay, there we go. So this is a picture. I wanted to give you first a picture this morning of what the Jews thought of Messiah. And this is long before Jesus came. And it's from something called the Targums, which is basically an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible. And it is just absolutely beautiful. This is in the writings of the Targums. And just to let you know, it is a translation of the Hebrew Bible, but it is more of a paraphrase than a literal word-for-word translation. But this is them writing about the Messiah. How beautiful is the King Messiah, who is to arise from among those of the house of Judah. How beautiful are the eyes of the King Messiah. Until the time King Messiah shall come, to whom the kingship belongs, to him shall all the kingdoms be subject. How beautiful is King Messiah. How beautiful are the eyes of King Messiah. Until the Messiah of justice, the sprout of David, comes forth, to him and to his seed has been given the covenant of kingship. How beautiful is King Messiah. How beautiful are the eyes of King Messiah. And this is once again from these writings as they are awaiting the coming Messiah. As we continue our Advent series and we are on peace, I wanted to start with and we're going to be camping out a little bit, and this idea of what peace is in the Old Testament. Because really, as they were waiting for this coming Messiah, it was during a chaotic time where they were waiting for peace. The Hebrew word for peace is shalom, which carries this idea of completeness, wholeness, and harmony. And you're like, why is there a picture of a wall that is like half broken? Because this is a picture of peace. This was actually a picture that was often brought up, was this idea that, hey, there is safety within these walls. And so when you have little cracks, you have little creaks, you have little bricks missing, you have things that are missing, then you are not at shalom. But when you are at shalom, there is this completeness, this wholeness. And it is not only about this wall being complete and finished and built, but it is also about what happens within those walls as a result of having this shalom. Shalom is a covenant-based peace. It means to be in alignment with the Creator and His design. So I hope you're starting to, as you know, when we talk about Old Testament stuff, I hope you're starting to bring it to New Testament and in your head starting to think, oh, how does this relate to me? Think about that. Just think about even that statement. How beautiful it would be for us to have shalom, to be in alignment with the Creator and His design, to be in alignment with Creator, but also His design in terms of all of creation, okay? So everything around us, that we are in line with the Creator and His design. And in this is the Jewish picture of what peace is. It isn't that everything's going right in our life, but it's actually that everything is right because we are in alignment with our Creator and His designs. There's so much gospel implication in this, right? And let me give you some examples of this now from the Bible, okay? First, in Leviticus, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments, I will give peace, shalom in the land. Great peace, shalom, have they who love your Torah, and nothing shall offend them. And so first, in this Jewish idea of what it means to be at peace, it is tied to their covenant relationship with God. Peace is tied to us being at peace with the giver of shalom. And when we are not at peace with Him, then we really should not expect the peace, these blessings, these things that we see in the Word of God. It starts with being rightly related to our Creator. In Genesis 15, it says, you, however, will go to your fathers in peace. This is God speaking to Abraham, shalom, and be buried at a good old age. So one of the things I want to point out is that sometimes this peace is conditional in that we see the previous passages that talked about how we have to obey and keep covenant. But other times, it is God who is just deciding that He's going to keep this peace. He made a promise to Abraham that remember, He told Abraham, hey, I want you to leave your country. I want you to go to the land where I'm going to show you. And, but He promises Abraham that one day he will go and he will be buried at a good old age. Imagine that. Imagine someone just tells you, hey, I want you to leave where you are today and whatever age you are, okay, but especially the younger you are, this probably hits home a little harder. And I just want you to go, and I'll lead you. Just trust me, follow me. And Abraham has no idea where Abraham's got a wife, he's got kids, he's probably thinking about a bazillion practical things, where are they going to get out of school, this and that. I know back then they didn't, but just to say very practically, as it relates to us, as God leads us, sometimes God leads us and we're like, we don't know where you're taking us. And God makes this promise to Abraham, follow me, trust me, and I will give you shalom. And He not only promised in His everyday life shalom, but He promised at the end of His life He was going to be buried at a good old age. And especially in the Old Testament, we see how often people's lives were cut short because of disobedience to God. Isaiah 32:17, and the work of righteousness shall be peace, shalom. And the effect of righteousness, quietness and assurance forever, right? This ought to hit home in terms of gospel truth. Here we're just simply talking about righteousness, right? What is the gospel? That we have no righteousness of our own. So we have to exchange our unrighteousness for God's righteousness, right? And that he makes us righteous. And that he makes us more like his son. And so we see here, even in the Old Testament, they are looking forward. And everything they are looking forward to is found in Jesus. And so now we come back to this picture. Oh, okay. Oh, it didn't, there's supposed to be an addition there of a word named Eirene, E-I-R-E-N-E, which is the Greek translation of shalom. And in the next slide I'll show you in a second after this, one of the things I want to really point out is that the New Testament word for peace really tries to convey an idea of shalom that is often missed in some of the usages of Eirene in the New Testament. Because Eirene in many ways is kind of more of a political term in terms of kind of more just meaning an absence of conflict, right? So they would say, oh, we are at Eirene. But especially in the Gospels, okay, we see that they're trying to restore this Old Testament idea of shalom, okay? And so that's where that's really important, okay? And so, they're trying to basically bring everything that encompasses in shalom in that, okay? And so, so let's go to the next slide here. And so this is a chart. And by the way, if you ever, I know you can take a cell phone pic or whatever, but I'm always glad to send you my slides. So if you ever need to message me, I will be happy to send this to you. So here's a really important thought, because here we're looking at Hebrew thought versus Greek thought. As it comes to truth in the Hebrew mind, it is something that is more experienced and obeyed. So now we're kind of thinking Old Testament, New Testament, okay? In the Greek thought, it's intellectual, but it's abstract. And so we could see how even Greek thought has kind of creeped into how we think today, right? Where is there such a thing as absolute truth? In the Hebrew mind, it was not only is there absolute truth, you either follow it or you don't. God's like, hey, that's why they had commandments, right? It's like, here's a commandment. Follow it, or did you follow it or did you not? That's the Hebrew way of thinking. The Greek thought is, okay, let's be intellectual about it. Let's talk about it, okay? And I want to say there's value to both. And that's kind of my point in giving you this chart and dissecting it for you, is basically, now that we're in this New Testament time, how do we bring some of that Old Testament back in and mix it together, right? Because this is all under the entire counsel of Scripture, and we need to think. We can't just be like, oh, Old Testament, that's yesterday. That doesn't, no. There's so much beauty that we're missing if we do that. And so, yes, truth. We do have to think about truth. We don't just do something or just accept something because someone smarter than us told us, or this and that. But it ultimately needs to be experienced and obeyed. In terms of knowledge, it needs to be, in Hebrew thought, it was relational and covenantal. In terms of Greek thought, it's theoretical and philosophical. So here's the example of this, is in Acts 17 at Mars Hill, where Paul goes and there's this altar to an unknown God, okay? And so basically the Greeks were like, we know there's a God, we just don't know which one is the correct one. So we'll just build an altar to as many of them as possible. And Paul comes and says, hey, this unknown God, I'm going to make, he can be known, and I'm going to make him known to you. And so we see this mix, right? Because remember, Paul is this guy when he talks about how he's the Jew of Jews, right? And how he has all these credentials, but he's also he was also a Pharisee, so he's both in Greek and Hebrew thought. And he combines the two in this beautiful picture where he talks to these people, theoretically, philosophically, yes. He says, this God that you're theorizing about, that you're philosophizing about, you can have a personal relation with him. And so that is a picture of knowledge. In terms of understanding, once again, the Old Testament, kind of the Hebrew thought is more doing, walking with God. In the Greek, it was more about debating and discussion. In terms of how things are done, in terms of language, in the Hebrew thought, things were more concrete, action-based. Versus in Greek thought, it's more noun-based. And really, one of the things that's beautiful about Shalom and Irene is kind of that the idea is that peace is both a noun, but it's also a verb. Peace is not just a passive peace. I really appreciated one commentator who I read, and I cannot remember his name right now, but he said, now that we have peace with God, we can now wage peace on the world. Isn't that crazy? We think of peace as just, oh, there's a lack of war, so, that's just nice, and that's pleasant for me. But he says, no, now that we have peace, we can wage peace on this world that's at war with each other and itself, right? Spirituality was this idea of obedience, that there was this Hebrew thought, there was this fear of Yahweh. In Greek thought, it was a mystical or just a personal experience. In Shalom, once again, there is this wholeness, this restored covenant. In Greek thought, it was just that there was no conflict. And as it comes to the scriptures, in the Hebrew thought, it was a covenant that you kept that required obedience. And in Greek thought, it was a moral philosophy and a spiritual guide. Now, keep in mind that, again, I'm not separating these two, because my whole point is that although there's times in the New Testament where this word Irene that's used in the New Testament for peace only conveys that there's no wars going on. In certain contexts, it's trying to include the idea of shalom in there. And that's really important for us, and that's really a question for us here today in December 11th. Is it December 11th? December 13th? Am I losing days? 14. Thank you. December 14th, 2025. The question for us today is peace to us just a lack of conflict? Just a lack of having any problems? Or is there a wholeness? Is it tied? Is our peace tied to being in right relationship with Jesus? Because if we think about it, Christmas is ultimately, yes, we are celebrating the birth of Jesus, but what did Jesus come to do? Even though they're two separate holidays, you can't ever separate Christmas and Easter. Christmas is the beginning of the story. Easter, Christ dies, he rises, and then we're waiting for the very end of the story, the second coming of Christ. And so, why am I focusing so much on this Hebrew thought, this Old Testament understanding of what it means to have peace? Because I think just like the time between Isaiah and Luke 2 is about 700 to 750 years, depending on who you rely on in terms of the dating of those writings. They were waiting with an expectation. And you and I, brothers and sisters, there's a way that God expects us to live as we are waiting for Messiah to come, his second coming, right? So now I'm going to show you some pictures. Once again, we return to this picture of a wall, okay? And this next picture, this one's a little bit more complicated. These are the newest Legos, okay? And these are actually taken from a Target ad. I am really glad that my nephews are growing out of that stage because you probably have to like take out a loan to be able to afford Legos these days. Like I remember a small little set cost like, like we're talking like maybe a stormtrooper and something, like probably cost like $100. I can't even imagine how much a set like this costs. But remember earlier I showed you that picture of a wall, right? And see, I'm showing you now what's inside the wall. And one of the things that you can see is, first of all, it's important, right, that you have this wall that's complete, so you have protection. But also, shalom carries this idea that everything going on inside the wall, everything in there is actually flourishing and functioning and functioning well. And that's important because I think one of the things it also shows us in this picture is that God understands how complicated life can get. And even in the midst of life being complicated, he says, I can give you shalom, but you have to trust me. You have to obey me. And this is seen very much in Jewish culture. I'll give you a couple of good examples of this that are hopefully very familiar. For Jewish people, what a common greeting is Shabbat Shalom. And what it literally means is, may you have a peaceful, a restful, or an easy fasting on the Sabbath. So they often fast on the Sabbath. But listen to the response when someone says Shabbat Shalom. Is Aleichem Shalom, which means peace be upon you. And I'm showing this to you to show you really this is like a part of, in many ways, their everyday life. This is their culture. This is their life, right? And what they're basically saying is that, and by the way, you could say Shabbat Shalom to people even as the days leading up to their preparation, their observation of the Sabbath, which usually starts on a Friday night, okay? And what they're saying is basically this: I have peace, now I'm going to give you peace. And their belief is because they're a covenant people and God is their God. And of course, where they went wrong is in two ways. Number one, that they kept this just for themselves when God had called them to, in another part of Isaiah, to be a light to the nations. So number one, yes, there's this peace that comes from God, but part of the reason that we need to be at peace with God is so that we can give this peace to other people. The other reason that they fell short is they started imitating the world around them, and that's where all this idolatry and all this stuff that happens in the Old Testament happens. So first of all, we see this just as part of the Jewish culture. I thought this was really cool. If someone, the term for congratulations in Jewish culture is Mazel Tov, right? And I thought this was really cool. If someone gives birth, you would say, Mazel Tov, congratulations. You have a new baby boy, you have a new baby girl, you have a new puppy, whatever, congratulations, right? But if they hadn't been named and you bring them into the room, you would say, Baruch haba, which means, blessed is the one who comes, okay? This is just such a small microcosm, but I'm just saying, this is a picture of how they viewed life, that the most central thing was being at peace, being at shalom with God. And when you are at shalom, we get these little glimpses of what comes out of our lives, that when we're at peace with God, we come across other people, peace to you, blessed to you. I wish nothing but blessing upon your life, right? We see that. And of course, we are super familiar with this one. The Aaronic blessing, the Lord bless you, keep you, the Lord make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you, lift his face upon you. And this was the way that they would say goodbye to each other. Until the next time I see you, may God bless you and it's all in caps, may Yahweh, the personal God, bless you. May he keep you. Make his face shine upon you. May he lift his face. May he give you peace. New Testament commentators often say that Paul had this in mind when he often begins and ends his letters with greetings of grace and peace. So is this idea, what is grace, right? It's the free gift of Jesus. And so Paul now says, whereas in the Old Testament, right, they have all this, there's this shalom. Now Paul basically says, hey, grace and peace. Now we have Jesus, the free gift of God. And what comes with that is peace. Now we get into our text. So Isaiah 9 is a prophecy, and it is about, and there is both an immediate and a later fulfillment. And so I'm just going to give you a summary, though, of Isaiah 7 to 8. It was too much to read. And by the way, I'm going to also share something with you really quick. I've gotten feedback before, like someone's like, why do you quote different versions of the Bible? You know, and here is the reason, okay, because I know I've been asked, someone actually asked me before to put every single Bible verse in the same version. This is why. Some translations of the Bible are word for word, okay? So when you do Bible study, I always sometimes will recommend to do like NASB, New King James, because those are literal word for word translations as close to the original text. Other translations, like the NIV and the ESV, are thought for thought, okay? So do you guys follow that? So there's some times where verses are very complicated, where I just want to give you thought for thought, because we can get caught up on a word, just like this morning. We could see how deep shalom is, right? And so we're like, hey, we don't have 9 hours to do a sermon. We're not in China in the underground church, right? Okay, so we're going to just, we're just going to go thought for thought. So sometimes I use other versions to summarize things, so I have to explain less so I can get to the point, okay? And so here we see in Isaiah 9:1-3 that there will be no gloom for him who anguished. So he says, in the former time, in a time that's to come, in the past, there was contempt in Zebulun and Naphtali. But in the later time, he made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, the Galilee of the nations. At that time, Israel was split into two kingdoms, a southern kingdom and a northern kingdom. There was a king named Ahaz, who's kind of one of the main characters in Isaiah chapter 7. And he is the king of the southern kingdom. And he's in this tight spot, because there's like a lot of war going on at that time. And the northern kingdom, has been kind of talking to Syria, and they're talking about forming this alliance so they can take out the southern kingdom. But then there's also this other enemy, which will arise later, the Assyrians. Okay, so Assyrians, two different groups, both pretty scary, savage people, okay, that just are really good at killing, okay, in terms of we're talking military here, not stereotyping or anything like that, okay? But we see also later, actually, that the northern kingdom tries to combine with the southern kingdom to fight against the Assyrians, okay? So Ahaz is in this really tough spot. He has to decide, am I going to build an alliance because I'm going to get outnumbered and I'm going to get crushed? Isaiah comes and tells Ahaz basically 65, he tells him down the line, and it happens 65 years later, both of these kingdoms are going to crush. He's like, don't worry about the northern kingdom, don't worry about the Syrians. They're not going to exist down the road. They're going to get crushed. And so he basically tells them, just trust God. Don't trust these alliances. Trust God. Ahaz, though, makes this decision that he's not going to trust God. And so we see that there's a lot of consequences that happen as a result of that. And I'm not here to make you an expert in Middle East history. I myself definitely do not know that much. But see, we are at the time of the year where we reflect on the first coming of Christ, where the Jews were looking forward and to Messiah, and they had a less complete understanding of Messiah. And people like Ahaz and people like you and me have to make choices as God is trying to direct us. And we have to make a choice to say yes or no to God. And there's a warning that there are consequences as well when we do not make the right choice. See, it's like, Pastor, why are you giving us such a heavy message? This is Christmas. Shouldn't we jingle bells and be happy? But again, Christ came. Yes, so joyous that Christ came to this earth. But he came to this earth to die on a cross, to return to the right hand of the Father, and we're just waiting for his second coming. And there's a lot of moments in between where we have Ahaz moments, where we have to decide, am I going to trust God? Am I going to not? Now, once again, Isaiah 9 begins some good news, but this is after all the bad news of 7 and 8. And that's the whole thing. Christmas, yes, joyous, time of great news. But great news, good news, always has bad news that precedes it, right? We can't talk about how glorious it is to follow God without understanding that we're so broken. We're so messed up without him. So he says, hey, look, Isaiah 9 here. There will be no gloom for her who is in anguish, right? And the key here word is, the word starts with but. But is something that is unexpected. It's an exception, and it's meant to motivate us. In the Bible, we see someone is lost, but now is found. Someone was blind, but now he sees. Someone was mourning, but now his mourning has turned into joy and dancing. Someone was living in the dominion of darkness, but now that someone is living for the kingdom of light. All because but God, but Christ. And here he talks about Galilee of the nations, the people who walked in darkness. His light has shone. And we see ultimately first that we know that Jesus' ministry will begin in Galilee. That a lot of his early ministry happened in this region of Galilee. Now Galilee is called Galilee of the nations, Galilee of the Gentiles, in the New Living Translation we read earlier. It's the northern part of Israel, so it was a place where all the immigrants, all the Gentiles came in. And so it was a place that was especially filled with darkness because of all the foreign gods that came in as a result of them coming in, okay? And so here's the thing. We want to be at peace with God. We want to be at peace within, and this is a work of the Holy Spirit. And we want to be at peace with those who come across our way. And even in the Old Testament, one of the first responsibilities that God gave man was to watch over the Garden of Eden, right? And to watch over creation, to be a steward, right? And so this idea of being at peace with God is the idea of trusting in his promises. There is this Old Testament understanding once again that our relationship with God, without it, we are incomplete, we are broken, and we are lacking shalom. God has a faithful history, however. It says, the yoke of his burden, the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor you have broken. On the day of Midian, for every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood, And basically, in Judges 8, he talks about a time of 40 years where these warriors are, and here in this passage, he's referring back there, where they're dividing these spoils that they won in war, and there's 40 years of peace after years of oppression. But in Gideon chapter 7 is a very familiar story to us, where Gideon has a bunch of men, and they're down by this river, and they're drinking water, and God tells them, hey, Gideon, pay attention to the way that they drink water, because I'm going to cut your army in half, right? I'm going to cut your army down to a whole lot less than you thought. And the whole idea, the whole lesson really was that they needed to trust God more than they needed to trust their own resources and themselves. And this in many ways is as much a part of the Christmas story as presents and gifts and mangers, right? And I'm just showing you that, yes, the Israelites, they saw that God was faithful to them. But brothers and sisters, we need a faithful history with God too. We need a history of but God moments, but Christ moments. We need to be able to look just like they did as God gave them encouragement, say, look at Midian. We need to have in our lives times when we said, man, I was going the wrong way, but God. I was this, but God, now I am going this way. We need our own faithful history. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. I'm going to run through this quick. Okay? So these are the names of God Father. First of all, Wonderful Counselor. And this idea of Wonderful Counselor, we get caught up in the word wonderful, so we just think, oh, it's telling us how great God is. Yes, but that word wonderful actually focuses on being full of wonders, okay? And so we see this in the Old Testament. There is endless stories of people seeking wisdom from God. And we really, one of the beautiful things about the Old Testament is that it's a lot of stories about a lot of people, and it comes down to one choice, right? It's like, do I trust God? Do I not trust God? And it doesn't even sometimes tell us what to do. It just shows us the results. This person was in this situation. God said, do this. This person, one scenario decides to listen to God. Other scenario decides not to. This is what happened. The Old Testament doesn't necessarily tell us, okay, therefore, go and do this. It just shows us, okay? And so God, wonderful, he's a God full. And we see this continuing in the ministry of Jesus, that he did all these miracles, right? Especially at the beginning of his ministry. And it said that people were astonished by his teachings. They were in awe or wonder. And so this wonderful counselor, Isaiah is predicting, is coming. Mighty God, powerful warrior, it's this idea, right? And we see this mix of both God's power, but also God's gentleness. David, a archetype, of Christ, right, is both a warrior and a shepherd. We see gentle Jesus, but we also see him working in might in the way that he acts, in the way that he transforms people. Mighty God, wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father. In the Old Testament especially, there is such an emphasis on the role of parents. And in the New Testament, we are adopted into God's family. He is an everlasting Father. And the Prince of Peace. In the Old Testament, we have Isaiah as our example. He's called the Prince of Peace. In the New Testament, we find the ultimate fulfillment at the return of Christ. And until then, there is an enemy at war. And remember, the enemy is called the Prince of the Air. Okay, this is in Ephesians 2:2. But we have Jesus who quiets the storm. And we have Emmanuel, God with us. He is God that is with us. Advent is a Latin word that means coming or arrival. And we see this in Acts 7:52 and 54. It says, "Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered." When they heard these things, they were enraged and they ground their teeth at him. And this is prior to the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr we see in the New Testament, after the coming of Christ. And so even then, he said, hey, back then, right? And sometimes something we have to remember, because we sometimes make this huge distinction between Old Testament, New Testament in terms of separating them. But one thing we have to remember is that as we're reading the New Testament in its context, they were still thinking very Old Testament-like, right? Because they were still trying to figure things out, right? And they didn't have the whole written, printed scriptures, right? There were these letters that came to people, and they would read them, and it was more of an oral tradition. So even here in Acts, right after Jesus has ascended, and the disciples now are going out and doing their thing, he says, "Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one." Okay. And he said, "Even him you have now betrayed and murdered." And these guys were like, "Nope, we're not having it, Stephen." Right? "As the lightning comes from the east and shines as farthest, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall be made light, each in his own order. Christ, the first fruits, then at his coming, those who belong to Christ." And it's kind of repetitive in many ways, but I'm trying to get at a point. I'm showing you all these verses about the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. "May the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another and for all, as we do for you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus." That in the same way, Isaiah, and I easily could have picked Micah. I think Micah was not as a familiar story, and there's other prophets I could have picked. They were looking for Christ's return. And brothers and sisters, this is what Christ is looking for from us too, that we are waiting for his return. Yes, at Christmas we celebrate his birth, but he came once again to change our lives, for us to then be a channel of blessing to other people, and to live life in a certain way as we wait for him to return. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our bodies. 2 Corinthians 4:10. So yes, we celebrate the birth of Jesus, but we got to remember he came to die on a cross so that we can have life in Jesus. But the purpose of having life in Jesus is to carry his death and allow that life to be shown to other people. And so that Advent then needs to be more than just a calendar where we're counting down the days until Christmas. Because if we do that, it's a very incomplete picture. This time of the year when we celebrate holidays, we say things like, we have Thanksgiving, and then we're like, oh, I wish we could be thankful all year long. We have Christmas. I wish this happy, joyful spirit. And yes, we are supposed to be spirit-filled people, that God's joy and all the fruits of the Spirit, love, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, all these things are coming out of us. But that's a big part of the point, is that it's not just a mental thing, as we showed with the Greek thought and the Hebrew thought. It's a life thing. It's an obedience thing. And we need to have that. Here's a good picture of it in Luke. Luke 2:14, glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to those on whom his favor rests. And then in Luke, so this is Luke 2:14, birth of Christ. Luke 10:5, when you enter a house, first say, peace to this house. This is how the disciples, when they started their ministry, that's what they did. They enter and they wish them peace, this shalom peace. And then 24:36, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. And this is after Jesus had died, was buried, resurrected, and he reappeared to his disciples. And his first word to them was, peace be with you. But it started with this peace that came from above, peace to those on whom his favor rests, us accepting this free gift of God, and then us taking it, bringing it to other people, and Jesus continuously being our peace. Guys, Christmas is more a story of holiness than it is just of happiness. And so I give you this message today, hoping that this idea really sticks in your head, that it's just not a seasonal thing, that this shalom, this peace of God, is available to us within a relationship with Jesus Christ. Let me invite the worship team up for our response.